My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes just 3 days after my son's funeral and said, "Get out, witch. You don't belong in this house anymore." She thought grief had made me weak. She thought I had nowhere else to go. What she didn't know was that my son had left behind something that would change everything. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the very end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far my story has traveled." The silence inside the house felt heavier than the flowers that still surrounded my son's portrait. Every room carried his memory. His favorite coffee mug was still sitting beside the sink. His work boots remained by the back door exactly where he'd left them the morning before the accident. I couldn't bring myself to move a single thing. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 70 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that love could hold a family together through anything. I spent 42 years raising my only son, Daniel, teaching him kindness, honesty, and compassion. When he married Olivia 12 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. I truly believed I had gained a daughter. I was wrong. Looking back now, I realized the signs had always been there. Olivia never shouted in front of Daniel. She smiled at church, volunteered at charity events, and always knew exactly what to say to make people admire her. But when we were alone, her warmth disappeared. Every compliment carried a hidden insult. Every smile concealed impatience. Daniel rarely noticed. Or perhaps he simply wanted peace more than conflict. After my husband passed away 8 years earlier, Daniel insisted that I move into the guest suite of their large home outside Denver. "You'll never be alone again, Mom," he had promised while holding my hands. "This is your home too." For years, I believed him. Then everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning. The highway accident took Daniel before the ambulance could reach the hospital. One phone call shattered the future I thought I still had. The funeral passed like a blur of black clothing, folded flags, casseroles from neighbors, and endless condolences that echoed without meaning. I barely slept during those first few nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel laughing somewhere down the hallway, only to wake and remember he was gone. 3 days after the funeral, Olivia asked me to join her for dinner. The dining room looked exactly as it always had, but something felt different. The air was cold despite the summer evening. She had set only 2 plates on the table. She never touched her food. Instead, she folded her napkin carefully, leaned back in her chair, and stared at me with eyes that held no trace of sorrow. "I've been patient long enough," she said calmly. I looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms. "Daniel's gone. There's no reason for you to stay here anymore." I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Surely I had misunderstood. "This is my home too," I whispered. A bitter smile spread across her face. "No," she replied. "It was Daniel's house. And now it's mine." Then she leaned across the table, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Get out, witch. Pack your things by Friday, and don't ever come back." Olivia's words hung in the air long after she stood up and carried her untouched plate into the kitchen. I remained at the dining table, unable to move. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, each second reminding me that life had continued, even though mine had stopped the day Daniel died. I looked around the room we had shared so many family dinners in. Thanksgiving turkeys. Christmas laughter. Daniel's birthday cakes. Every memory seemed to belong to another lifetime. Now the same room felt cold and unfamiliar. For the first time since moving into the house, I felt like a stranger. I quietly cleared my own plate, washed the dishes, and wiped the countertop exactly as I had done hundreds of times before. Habit was easier than thinking. If my hands kept moving, perhaps my heart would stop hurting for a little while. That night, I walked slowly down the hallway to the guest suite Daniel had prepared for me years earlier. He had painted the walls himself. "I know blue helps you sleep, Mom," he'd said with that gentle smile that always reminded me of his father. The faded blue walls were still there. His framed photograph from our trip to Yellowstone sat on my dresser. I picked it up carefully and traced the edge of the frame with my thumb. "You promised I'd never be alone," I whispered into the empty room. The silence answered me. Sleep never came. Instead, I listened to unfamiliar sounds drifting through the house. Cabinet doors opening. Footsteps upstairs. Olivia talking on the phone in a cheerful voice I hadn't heard since before the funeral. She wasn't grieving anymore. If anything, she sounded relieved. The following morning, I woke before sunrise and made myself a cup of coffee. The kitchen window overlooked Daniel's favorite oak tree, where he used to hang bird feeders every spring. Cardinals still landed on its branches, unaware that the man who fed them was gone. As I stood there, I noticed something unusual. Several cardboard boxes had been stacked beside the garage door. My name was written across each one in thick black marker. Margaret. Guest room. Clothes. Books. My stomach tightened. I hadn't packed a single thing. Someone else had. Later that afternoon, I walked back into my room and immediately realized something was missing. The cedar chest at the foot of my bed had been moved several inches. Inside that chest were old family photographs, letters from my late husband, and the leather journal Daniel had kept during his final year of college. Someone had gone through my belongings. I didn't accuse Olivia. Not yet. Instead, I quietly closed the lid, sat on the edge of the bed, and allowed myself one long, steady breath. Grief had taught me that emotions could cloud judgment. If there was one lesson my husband had repeated throughout our marriage, it was simple. Asterisk, never make your biggest decision on your worst day. Asterisk. I intended to remember that. Because deep inside, I could no longer shake the feeling that Daniel had anticipated something like this long before I ever did. The next morning, I decided to pretend that everything was normal. Not because I was afraid of Olivia. Because I wanted to understand exactly what she was planning. I made breakfast as I always had. Bacon, scrambled eggs, and fresh biscuits. The familiar routine steadied my hands even though my heart still felt unbearably heavy. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen, but the warmth that once filled this house had disappeared with Daniel. Olivia walked downstairs dressed for work in an expensive navy suit. She barely looked at me. "Morning," she muttered as she grabbed her travel mug. "Good morning," I replied with a small smile. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened a folder lying on the kitchen island and began flipping through several documents. As she hurried out the front door, she forgot to close the folder. I wasn't the kind of woman who enjoyed invading someone's privacy. In 70 years, I'd learned that trust was worth more than curiosity. But something told me to look. I walked over slowly. The first page was a real estate brochure. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words. Luxury property listing proposal. My pulse quickened. The address beneath it was unmistakable. Our house. There were handwritten notes in the margin. Asterisk, stage guest room first. Asterisk. Asterisk, remove personal items. Asterisk. Asterisk, list within 2 weeks. Asterisk. I stood perfectly still. 2 weeks. That explained why Olivia had demanded I leave by Friday. She wasn't simply forcing me out. She intended to sell the home Daniel had loved without wasting a single moment. Before I could read further, I heard the garage door closing as Olivia drove away. I quietly placed every page back exactly where I'd found it. By lunchtime, another unsettling discovery appeared. A moving company had left several empty packing boxes on the front porch. The delivery receipt listed Olivia's name. Estimated move date. 10 days. That afternoon, I wandered into Daniel's home office. His desk had always been immaculate. Every pen aligned. Every folder labeled in his careful handwriting. Now several drawers stood slightly open. Someone had searched through them recently. The small wooden box where Daniel kept important family documents was gone. So was the fireproof envelope that had always remained inside the office safe. A chill ran through me. Daniel had been incredibly organized. He never misplaced important papers. Someone had removed them deliberately. When Olivia returned home that evening, she acted as though nothing had happened. She chatted casually about grocery prices while scrolling through her phone. Every few minutes, she smiled at a message on the screen. I noticed something else. Whenever she thought I wasn't looking, she'd glance toward Daniel's office. Not with sadness. With anticipation. As though she was waiting for something. Or making sure something stayed hidden. That night, I sat quietly in my room holding the framed photograph of Daniel taken on his 40th birthday. He looked so confident that day. So peaceful. Almost as if he already knew his time was limited and had spent his final years putting everything in order. I gently wiped a layer of dust from the frame. Did you leave me something, sweetheart? I whispered into the darkness. I hope you did. Because for the first time since Olivia told me to leave, I was beginning to believe my son's final act of love wasn't over yet. That evening, after Olivia had gone upstairs, I stayed alone in the living room with only the soft glow of a table lamp for company. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. It reminded me of all the evenings Daniel and I had spent talking after dinner while everyone else had gone to bed. He always worried about me more than I worried about myself. 8 years earlier, after my husband, Thomas, passed away from cancer, I had insisted on staying in the little ranch house where we'd spent nearly 40 years together. Every corner carried his memory. The porch swing he built with his own hands. The maple tree we planted when Daniel was born. I couldn't imagine leaving. Daniel had visited almost every weekend. One Sunday afternoon, he sat beside me on that old porch swing, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Mom, he said gently, Dad spent his whole life making sure you were safe. Let me do the same. I laughed and told him I wasn't an old woman who needed looking after. He smiled. You'll always be my mom. That's never going to change. 6 months later, I agreed to sell my house and move into the guest suite of the beautiful home he and Olivia had recently purchased. It wasn't because Olivia wanted me there. Even then, I sensed her hesitation whenever the subject came up. But Daniel insisted. He personally designed my room. He added wider doorways in case I ever needed a walker someday. He installed brighter reading lights because he knew my eyesight wasn't what it used to be. He even built bookshelves along one wall because he refused to let me leave behind my collection of mystery novels. You're not moving into a guest room, he'd told me while tightening the last shelf with a screwdriver. You're moving into your home. At the time, I believed those words would always be true. Looking back now, I realized Olivia rarely participated in those conversations. Whenever Daniel discussed family plans, she would politely excuse herself. I have emails to answer. I need to call my sister. There are errands I forgot. I had mistaken her absence for independence. Now I wondered if it had been resentment. There had been other moments too, small enough to ignore at the time. She complained whenever Daniel spent too much time helping me around the house. She rolled her eyes when he drove me to doctor's appointments instead of asking her. On holidays, she quietly rearranged seating so I ended up farther from Daniel at the dinner table. Each incident seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they painted a very different picture. She hadn't started pushing me away after Daniel died. She had simply stopped pretending. As midnight approached, I opened the cedar chest once more and carefully sorted through the letters Thomas had written during our first years of marriage. Near the bottom lay a birthday card Daniel had given me just 6 months before the accident. His handwriting covered nearly the entire page. One sentence caught my attention immediately. Asterisk, no matter what happens, Mom, I promise you'll always be protected. Asterisk. I read those words again. And again. Daniel had never made promises lightly. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Not happiness. Not relief. Hope. A quiet, cautious hope that somewhere, somehow, my son had already seen the storm coming, and had found a way to shelter me from it, even after he was gone. The following afternoon, while Olivia was out meeting with what she claimed was her financial advisor, I heard the front doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I found an elderly gentleman standing on the porch wearing a neatly pressed gray suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite the afternoon breeze, and he carried a worn leather briefcase tucked beneath one arm. He smiled kindly. "Mrs. Margaret Collins?" "Yes. My name is Charles Bennett. I'm your late son's attorney." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Daniel had never mentioned hiring a private attorney, although it certainly wasn't impossible. He had become very successful during the last decade of his career as a civil engineer, and he believed in planning ahead. "I hope I'm not intruding," Charles continued gently. "May I come in? There are several matters regarding Daniel's estate that should have been discussed with you already." A strange feeling settled in my stomach. "They haven't." His expression changed immediately. "They haven't?" I shook my head. "The funeral was only a few days ago. Olivia said everything legal would take months." Charles frowned. "It shouldn't." We sat together in the living room where afternoon sunlight spilled across Daniel's favorite armchair. Charles opened his briefcase and carefully removed a thick envelope. "Daniel visited my office 3 months before his accident," he explained. "He updated several legal documents and left very specific instructions." My heartbeat quickened. "He talked about me?" Charles smiled. "Quite a bit." He adjusted his glasses before continuing. "He said, if anything ever happens to me, my mother will pretend she's fine. She always does. Please make sure someone looks after her because she'll never ask for help herself." My eyes filled with tears. That sounded exactly like Daniel. Charles waited respectfully before speaking again. "He also instructed me to personally confirm that you received certain documents." "What documents?" He looked surprised. "The sealed family packet." I stared at him. I've never seen anything like that. He slowly lowered the papers onto his lap. "I personally delivered it to this address 2 days after Daniel signed everything." The room suddenly felt colder. "Who accepted it?" Charles checked a note inside his folder. "According to my records, Olivia signed for the delivery." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he sighed. "I was under the impression she had already given it to you." I slowly shook my head. "No." He leaned back thoughtfully. "Mrs. Collins, I believe your son expected there might be complications." Those words stayed with me. Complications. Daniel hadn't been a suspicious man. He trusted people. Especially family. If even he had worried enough to prepare extra protections, then perhaps he had seen things I had refused to notice. Charles reached back into his briefcase. "I can't release the contents of the sealed packet without following Daniel's written instructions." My heart sank. "But..." He smiled. "I can tell you one thing." I looked up. "Your son loved you very much." He paused before adding quietly. "And based on everything I prepared for him, I strongly suggest you don't leave this house until we've had another meeting." For the first time since Olivia had ordered me out, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Someone else knew there was a missing piece. And whatever Olivia had hidden inside that sealed packet, she was becoming increasingly desperate to keep it that way. Charles left just before sunset. As I watched his car disappear down the street, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Daniel's funeral. I no longer felt helpless. For days, I'd allowed grief to cloud my judgment. I'd accepted Olivia's cruelty because I believed I had no strength left to fight. But Charles's visit reminded me of something Daniel had inherited from his father. We never acted without a plan. I quietly locked the front door and returned to the living room. The envelope Charles had shown me remained vivid in my mind. A sealed family packet. Delivered to this very house. Signed for by Olivia. Hidden from me. If she had concealed one document, how many others had disappeared? I wasn't interested in revenge. I wanted the truth. That evening, Olivia returned home carrying several shopping bags. She looked unusually cheerful. I picked up dinner, she announced, placing 2 takeout containers on the kitchen counter. It was the first pleasant thing she'd said to me in days. The sudden kindness immediately made me suspicious. During dinner, she chatted about trivial things. A new coffee shop had opened downtown. Gas prices were finally dropping. One of her coworkers was planning a vacation to Florida. Not once did she mention the attorney. Not once did she ask how I'd spent my afternoon. She assumed I knew nothing. I decided to keep it that way. After dinner, she stood and smiled politely. I've scheduled movers for Friday morning. I looked at her calmly. I thought you said I had until Friday. You do. She folded her arms. They'll arrive early. There wasn't a trace of sympathy in her voice. Only efficiency. As if she were discussing furniture instead of a grieving mother. I see, I replied quietly. She appeared almost disappointed that I didn't argue. Without another word, she walked upstairs. An hour later, I heard the shower running in her bathroom. The opportunity had arrived. I slipped quietly into Daniel's office. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and the coffee he drank every morning. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across his desk. I carefully examined every drawer. Tax files. Engineering blueprints. Insurance policies. Nothing unusual. Then I remembered something. Years earlier, Daniel had laughed while showing me a small hidden compartment inside the bookshelf. Dad loved secret compartments, he'd said. I guess I inherited that from him. My pulse quickened. I ran my fingers beneath the lowest shelf. Nothing. Then I pressed gently against the side panel. A soft click echoed through the room. The narrow compartment slowly opened. Inside rested a small black flash drive. Beside it lay a folded note written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Across the front were just 4 words. For Mom. Only Mom, asterisk asterisk. My hands began to tremble. I had finally found something Olivia hadn't discovered. Before I could unfold the note, I heard footsteps creaking across the upstairs hallway. They stopped. Then began descending the staircase. Olivia. I quickly slipped the flash drive and note into the pocket of my cardigan, pushed the hidden compartment closed, and sat down behind Daniel's desk just as the office door opened. Olivia stood in the doorway, narrowing her eyes. I thought I heard someone in here, she said. I offered a tired smile. I was just missing him. For a long moment, she searched my face. Then her gaze slowly drifted across the bookshelf. Something in her expression changed. It lasted only a second. But I caught it. Fear. She wasn't afraid of losing the house. She was afraid that I had found something she had spent days trying to hide. And without realizing it, Olivia had just confirmed that whatever Daniel left for me was far more important than either of us had imagined. The moment Olivia walked away from Daniel's office, I waited another 5 minutes before moving. Patience had become my greatest ally. I listened carefully until I heard her bedroom door close upstairs. Only then did I quietly return to my room, lock the door behind me, and pull the folded note from my cardigan pocket. My hands trembled so badly that I had to smooth the paper against the bedside table before I could read it. Daniel's familiar handwriting instantly brought tears to my eyes. It read, Asterisk Mom, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. I pray I'm still alive when you find this. But if I'm not, promise me one thing. Don't trust anyone until you've seen what's on this flash drive. Asterisk. I stopped reading. My vision blurred. Even now, Daniel sounded more concerned about protecting me than himself. I wiped away my tears and continued. Asterisk, there are copies of every important document, every email, every financial record, and every conversation I thought you might one day need. If everything is fine, you'll never have to open it. But if someone tries to take away your home, you'll know what to do. Asterisk, I stared at the words for what felt like forever. Daniel hadn't simply planned his estate. He had prepared for betrayal. The thought broke my heart. What had he seen that I hadn't? What had made him believe someone close to us might one day turn against me? The flash drive suddenly felt heavier than it should. I owned an old laptop that Daniel had given me years earlier. It wasn't fast, but it still worked. I carried it to the kitchen after midnight, knowing Olivia always took sleeping pills and rarely woke before morning. The screen flickered to life. My pulse raced as I inserted the flash drive. Several folders appeared. Family documents. Property records. Personal letters. And one folder simply labeled, "If Mom is forced to leave." A chill ran through me. With a shaky breath, I opened it. Inside were dozens of scanned documents. The very first file caught my attention. House ownership agreement. I clicked it open. To my complete surprise, Daniel's name wasn't the only one listed on the deed. Mine was there too. Joint ownership with rights of survivorship. I covered my mouth in disbelief. Legally, half of the house already belonged to me. Olivia couldn't simply throw me out. She couldn't sell the property without my written consent. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might wake the entire house. No wonder she'd hidden the attorney's envelope. No wonder she'd rushed to move me out before I spoke to anyone. She had been counting on my ignorance. I kept reading. Another file contained a series of emails between Daniel and his attorney. One sentence stood out immediately. Asterisk, if anything ever happens to me unexpectedly, please make sure my mother learns the truth before anyone attempts to transfer or sell the property. Asterisk, Daniel had anticipated exactly what was happening. Not because he distrusted me. Because he understood someone else. As I continued scrolling through the files, another folder caught my eye. Its name made my stomach tighten. Security Camera Archive. There were dozens of video clips saved by date. I clicked the most recent one, recorded just 2 weeks before Daniel died. The video began in silence. Then Olivia walked into Daniel's office carrying a stack of papers. She looked around to make sure she was alone. What she did next caused my blood to run cold. She opened his desk drawer, removed several legal documents, and quietly slipped them into her handbag. I froze. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was proof. For the first time since Daniel's death, I wasn't grieving blindly. I was looking directly at the truth. And Olivia had no idea that her carefully constructed lie had just begun to fall apart. I barely slept that night. The security footage replayed over and over in my mind. Every movement Olivia made had been calm, deliberate, almost practiced. She hadn't stumbled upon Daniel's documents by accident. She knew exactly what she was looking for. Yet I forced myself to close the laptop. Charles had been right. Daniel had been right. The worst mistake I could make now was letting Olivia know I had discovered the truth. The following morning, I walked downstairs as though nothing had changed. Olivia was already sitting at the kitchen island, sipping her coffee while scrolling through her phone. She glanced up briefly. "I called the movers," she said matter-of-factly. "They'll be here tomorrow at 9. I buttered a slice of toast before answering. "That sounds organized." She looked almost disappointed by my calm response. I expected more of a fight. I smiled faintly. I've learned that arguing rarely changes anyone's mind. For a second, she simply stared at me. Then she shrugged. "Good." She finished her coffee and left for work without another word. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I called Charles Bennett. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Collins?" "I found what Daniel left me." There was a brief silence. "I thought you might." I also found evidence that Olivia hid legal documents before Daniel passed away. His voice became noticeably firmer. Do not confront her. I wasn't planning to. Good. Bring everything to my office this afternoon. Every file. Every video. We'll make certified copies immediately. At 1 o'clock, I arrived at Charles's office carrying my old laptop inside a canvas shopping bag. He carefully reviewed every document stored on the flash drive. His normally calm expression grew increasingly serious. When the security footage appeared on the screen, he removed his glasses and leaned closer. That's enough, he said quietly after the clip ended. What does it mean? It means your son documented exactly what he feared. Charles opened another folder that I hadn't examined closely. Inside was a signed affidavit written by Daniel only 6 weeks before his death. Charles read aloud. Asterisk, I believe my wife may attempt to remove or conceal legal documents concerning my mother's rights. Therefore, duplicate copies have been stored electronically and with my attorney. Asterisk. I covered my mouth. He knew. Charles nodded slowly. He hoped he was wrong. We spent the next 2 hours organizing every piece of evidence. Charles made multiple certified copies and placed the originals inside a secure office safe. If anything happens to these files at your house, he explained, the evidence still exists. For the first time in days, I felt genuinely protected. Before I left, Charles handed me a sealed envelope. What's this? Instructions from Daniel. I can read them now. You were always allowed to, he replied gently. He simply asked me to wait until I knew you were safe. I slipped the envelope into my purse without opening it. Somehow, I wanted to read Daniel's words in the quiet of my own room. When I returned home that evening, something immediately caught my attention. The front door wasn't fully closed. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Slowly, I stepped inside. The house was unnaturally silent. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. Not one person. 2. Olivia wasn't supposed to be home for another hour. I quietly climbed 3 steps before voices drifted down the hallway. One belonged to Olivia. The other belonged to a man I didn't recognize. She'll be gone tomorrow, Olivia whispered confidently. Once the movers take her things, we can finally empty the safe. The man chuckled. And she'll never know what was really inside. I stood frozen on the staircase. They weren't just trying to force me out anymore. They were looking for something they still hadn't found. And thanks to Daniel, I already had it. I remained perfectly still on the staircase, barely daring to breathe. The wooden handrail felt cold beneath my fingers as Olivia and the man continued talking inside Daniel's office. Every instinct told me to march upstairs and demand answers. But Daniel had taught me something years ago. Asterisk, the person who speaks first rarely holds the strongest position. Asterisk. So I listened. I searched every drawer twice, the man said in a low voice. If Daniel left another copy, it isn't here. Olivia sighed impatiently. It has to be. You said the attorney only delivered 1 packet. He did. Then where's the rest of it? There was a long silence. Finally, Olivia answered with frustration. I don't know. Daniel started acting strangely during the last few months. He kept saying he wanted everything properly documented. I thought he was just being overly cautious. I slowly stepped back down the stairs before either of them could notice me. My heart pounded, but not from fear anymore. They were searching for evidence they couldn't find because it was already sitting safely inside Charles Bennett's office. For the first time since Daniel's death, Olivia was the one losing control. I quietly slipped out the front door and sat on the porch swing Daniel had installed shortly after I moved in. A few minutes later, the front door opened. Olivia smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. Oh, there you are. I needed some fresh air. She nodded. I thought you had already packed. I'm almost finished. She leaned against the porch railing. The movers will arrive at 9 sharp tomorrow. I hope everything goes smoothly. I'm sure it will. She studied my face carefully. You seem calmer today. I've had time to think. She smiled with obvious relief. I think that's for the best. As she walked back inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. She believed she had already won. That confidence would become her greatest mistake. The next morning, 2 large moving trucks pulled into the driveway exactly at 9 o'clock. 4 movers stepped out wearing matching uniforms. Before they could reach the front door, another vehicle stopped behind them. It was Charles Bennett's black sedan. He wasn't alone. A middle-aged woman wearing a navy blazer climbed out of the passenger seat carrying a leather portfolio. Olivia opened the front door just as they approached. Her smile vanished. What is this? Charles remained perfectly composed. Good morning, Mrs. Collins. Olivia folded her arms. I wasn't expecting visitors. I know. He handed her a business card. This is Rebecca Lawson, a licensed probate specialist assigned to review the administration of Daniel Collins's estate. Rebecca offered a polite smile. We're here to verify several legal matters before any personal property is removed from the residence. Olivia's face lost its color. What legal matters? Charles calmly opened his briefcase. The ownership of this home. Olivia laughed nervously. There's nothing to verify. I'm Daniel's widow. Charles looked directly into her eyes. That is only part of the story. He removed a certified copy of the property deed. I believe it's time everyone reviewed what Daniel actually signed. Standing quietly behind the screen door, I watched Olivia's confident expression begin to crack for the very first time. She had expected movers. She had expected me to leave. She had never expected the law to arrive before the furniture did. The driveway, which I had expected to witness my final humiliation, suddenly became the stage for something entirely different. The movers stood awkwardly beside their truck, unsure whether to unload dollies or simply wait. Rebecca Lawson opened her portfolio with practiced confidence while Charles Bennett laid several certified documents across the dining room table. Olivia remained standing. She refused to sit. I don't understand why any of this is necessary, she said, forcing a smile that no longer reached her eyes. Daniel's estate belongs to me. I'm his surviving spouse. Rebecca nodded politely. In many situations, that would be true. Olivia immediately relaxed. But not this one. The room fell silent. Rebecca slid the first document toward her. This property was purchased under a joint ownership agreement between Daniel Collins and Margaret Collins. Olivia frowned. That's impossible. It isn't. Charles pointed toward the signatures at the bottom of the deed. These are certified copies filed with the county recorder's office over 6 years ago. Olivia grabbed the papers with trembling hands. No. She flipped through each page faster and faster. No, there has to be another version. There isn't, Charles replied calmly. The original matches these copies exactly. Olivia looked at me for the first time that morning. You knew? I met her eyes without anger. I only learned the truth a few days ago. Her breathing became uneven. But Daniel told me. She stopped herself. Charles quietly raised an eyebrow. What exactly did Daniel tell you? Olivia didn't answer. Because she couldn't. Every sentence she spoke now carried the risk of exposing the lies she'd been living for years. Rebecca continued reviewing the documents. Under the terms of this deed, neither owner could sell the property without the written consent of the other. She closed the folder. That means no listing, no transfer, and no sale may legally proceed without Mrs. Margaret Collins' approval. Outside, the movers exchanged confused glances. One of them removed his work gloves. So, are we moving anything today? No, Rebecca answered firmly. Not until ownership issues are fully resolved. Olivia's carefully planned schedule collapsed before her eyes. The moving company. The real estate listing. The empty boxes stacked in the garage. Every step depended on removing me first. Now none of it could happen. She suddenly slammed both hands onto the dining table. This isn't fair. The outburst surprised everyone. I've lived here for 12 years, she shouted. I helped pay the bills. I took care of this house. I looked at her quietly. So did Daniel. She turned toward me with tears of frustration filling her eyes. He would have wanted me to have everything. Charles spoke before I could. Actually, Mrs. Collins. He opened another folder. We have written evidence explaining exactly what Daniel wanted. He placed a sealed letter on the table. Across the front, in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, were the words. To be opened if my mother is ever forced from her home. The room became perfectly still. Even Olivia stopped breathing. She recognized the handwriting immediately. So did I. My fingers shook as I picked up the envelope. For a moment, I simply stared at Daniel's name. It felt as though he were sitting beside me once again, quietly reminding me that love doesn't always end with goodbye. Sometimes. It leaves behind the courage to finish what someone else could no longer protect. My hands trembled as I carefully broke the seal on the envelope. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper as I unfolded Daniel's letter. His handwriting looked exactly as I remembered, neat, steady, and unmistakably his. I took a slow breath and began reading aloud. Asterisk, Mom, if you're hearing these words, then my greatest fear has become reality. Asterisk. My voice caught, but I continued. Asterisk, first, I need you to know one thing. None of this is your fault. You have given me nothing but love for my entire life. If anyone ever makes you feel unwanted in this house, remember this, it has always been your home as much as mine. Asterisk. Tears blurred my vision. Charles quietly handed me a handkerchief. I smiled gratefully and continued. Asterisk, I hope Olivia proves me wrong. I truly do. I married her because I believed people could change when they were loved enough. Asterisk. Olivia lowered her head. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Asterisk, but over the past 2 years, I've discovered financial decisions made without my knowledge, documents moved from my office, and conversations that made me question whether my mother would be safe if I were no longer here. Asterisk. The room became painfully quiet. Rebecca slowly looked toward Olivia. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Daniel's own words spoke louder than any accusation. I kept reading. Asterisk, that is why I updated every legal document, recorded copies of important files, and asked Charles Bennett to protect them until the proper time. Asterisk. Charles nodded slightly. I followed his instructions exactly. I looked back at the letter. Asterisk, Mom, please don't spend your remaining years fighting people who no longer choose kindness. Asterisk. Those words struck me harder than anything else. Daniel wasn't asking me to seek revenge. He wanted me to choose peace. Asterisk, if Olivia sincerely apologizes and accepts responsibility, I hope you find forgiveness in your heart. Not because she deserves it, but because carrying bitterness is too heavy for someone who has already carried so much love. Asterisk. I stopped reading for a moment. That sounded exactly like my son. Even after preparing for betrayal, he still believed compassion mattered. Then came the final paragraph. Asterisk, as for the house, my wishes are simple. My mother has the legal right to remain here for as long as she chooses. No one has the authority to remove her. If she ever decides to leave, it must be her decision and hers alone. Asterisk. I folded the letter slowly. No one moved. Olivia's eyes were fixed on the floor. The confidence she'd carried for weeks had completely disappeared. Finally, she spoke. Barely above a whisper. I didn't think he'd know. Charles answered calmly. He knew more than you realized. She covered her face with both hands. I never meant for it to become this.